General Hospital spoilers reveal that as Jason prepared to leave Port Charles for a dangerous mission tied to Britt, the entire town seemed to shift under the weight of another coming storm. What should have been a silent departure, one more sacrifice in the shadows, was suddenly becoming something far more personal and far more devastating. Jason believed he could handle the risk of leaving, believed he could bury his fear the way he always did, but this time the damage was already spreading before he had even disappeared. Scout was falling into a painful place of confusion and anger, overwhelmed by the sense that every adult around her was making decisions that kept tearing her family apart. At the same time, Danny was being pulled towards a new darkness, trapped in emotional fallout that no child should have to carry. The pressure building around Danny was no longer small or temporary. It felt like the beginning of something dangerous, something that could have left permanent scars if no one stood up for him in time. That was where Scout began to change. She was no longer just a quiet little girl watching the chaos from the sidelines. She could feel that Danny was being cornered by grief, fear, and silence. It awakened something fierce inside her. Scout started fighting in the only way she knew how, refusing to let Danny be treated like an afterthought while the adults chased secrets, missions, and unfinished wars. She wanted answers, fairness, and protection for her brother. And her growing determination became impossible to ignore. Every emotional outburst, every sharp question, every stubborn refusal to stay quiet carried the same message. Danny mattered, and she would not allow him to be swallowed by the darkness closing in around him. For Jason, that became the cruelest shock of all. He could face enemies, bullets, and betrayal, but watching Scout carry a burden far beyond her years hit him in a place no physical threat ever could. He was leaving Port Charles to help Britt, stepping into another mission wrapped in danger and secrecy. Yet the real crisis was already inside his own family. Every instinct in him screamed to stay, to protect Danny, to shield Scout from becoming hardened by the pain too soon. But the deeper the situation became, the more Jason realized his departure might not just be another mission. It might become the choice that changes everything. If he left, he risked losing the fragile trust of the children who still needed him. If he stayed, he risked abandoning a mission that could unleash even greater consequences. And if that impossible space between duty and family, Jason faced a truth more terrifying than any enemy. Port Charles was not simply watching him go. It was daring him to choose which heartbreak he was willing to live with. A terrifying new wave of chaos is beginning to close in around Scout, and this time the fear surrounding her is no longer something she can ignore or escape. The people around her are becoming more unstable, more secretive, and far more dangerous, which is pushing her towards an emotional breaking point. Drew is no longer simply troubled or confused. He is becoming controlled in ways that feel darker and more disturbing by the day. And even when he is physically present, there is a growing sense that the real Drew is slipping further away. For Scout, that is the cruelest part of all. She can feel that something is terribly wrong with her father, but she is too young to fully understand the forces manipulating him. All she knows is that the man who should make her feel safe is becoming part of the nightmare. At the same time, Alexis and Jason are being dragged into their own spiraling crisis, and their involvement only deepens the tension around Scout. Alexis is trying to hold together a reality that keeps breaking apart in front of her, while Jason once again is being pulled into danger, secrecy, and impossible choices. Every adult in Scout's world seems to be fighting a private war. That constant instability is starting to leave scars on her. She is no longer just frightened. She is angry, overwhelmed, and emotionally exploding under the pressure of watching her family fall deeper into madness. What makes this even more haunting is that Scout is beginning to sense that these crises are all connected. Drew's condition, Alexis' growing panic, Jason's involvement, and all of it seems like part of one larger, more sinister storm. Realization what makes Scout's pain so explosive. She is trapped in a world where every answer leads to another lie, every attempt at safety leads to another danger, and every person she loves seems to be slipping into darkness. If this spiral continues, Scout may no longer remain the quiet child caught in the middle. She may become the emotional center of the entire disaster. The one person whose breakdown exposes just how deeply this nightmare has poisoned everyone around her. Sam's strongest trait seems to be rising inside Scout in ways that are impossible to ignore. And that is what makes this new storyline feel so emotionally explosive. It is not just that Scout reminds people of her mother in small, ordinary ways. It is the intensity of her instincts. The fierce way she protects the people she loves, quiet intelligence she shows when everyone around her is distracted by fear and chaos. Scout is beginning to react to danger the way Sam once did, with a sharp inner strength that feels almost too powerful for someone so young. That change is becoming impossible for Jason to overlook, and it is starting to haunt him more deeply than he wants to admit. What makes the situation even more unsettling is that the possibility that Scout is hiding a secret, something she has seen, heard, or understand before anyone else. Jason can feel that there is something different in the way she watches people, in the way she hesitates before speaking, and in the way her words seem to carry meaning far beyond her age. Every moment with Scout now feels loaded with tension, as if she is standing at the edge of revealing something that could blow up everything Jason is trying to hold together. Instead of making his path clearer, Scout's behavior is making his journey harder, more emotional, and far more dangerous. Jason is no longer dealing with only external threats. He is now struggling with the painful truth that Scout may be carrying a piece of Sam's spirit in more ways than anyone expected. That possibility shakes him because it seems Sam's influence is still alive, still moving through the people she loved most, and still capable of changing everything. If Scout finally reveals the secret she has been holding on to, the fragile balance around Jason could collapse all at once. That is why the story feels ready to erupt. It is no longer just about grief, memory, or unfinished missions. It is about a child stepping into the emotional legacy of her mother, forcing Jason to face a truth that may be even harder than loss itself. Jason going to Canada alone would completely change the emotional weight of this storyline. It would no longer feel like an escape plan built on hope, love, and survival. Instead, it would feel like the decision of a man who has finally started to believe that everyone around him is safer without him. That is what gives this version of the story so much pain. Jason would not be leaving because he stopped caring. He would be leaving because he cares too much, and because the growing disaster around Scout is forcing him to see his life in a way he has tried to avoid for a long time. At first, the plan may have seemed clear. Jason and Britt were supposed to disappear together, get to Canada, and buy time while her medication was being reverse-engineered. It was a plan born out of urgency, but it still carried a fragile sense of possibility. For once, Jason was not only thinking about how to eliminate a threat. He was thinking about a future, even if it was uncertain. He was thinking about what it might mean to choose Britt, to protect her, and to step away from the endless cycle of violence and damage that has defined so much of his life. But once the story shifts and Jason prepares to leave on his own, everything changes. The trip stops representing hope and starts representing surrender. That is where Scout becomes the emotional center of the entire arc. She does not need to be the villain, and she does not need to do anything deliberately cruel. In fact, the storyline becomes stronger if Scout is simply the person whose pain forces the truth into the open. Whatever crisis she is bringing into Jason's world, whether it is emotional instability, family fallout, or the kind of disaster that spreads quietly before exploding, it shakes Jason in a way enemies never could. Ross Cullum is dangerous, yes, but men like Cullum are the kind of threat Jason understands. He knows how to handle violence. He knows how to respond to betrayal. What he does not know how to handle is the emotional destruction that reaches him through someone like Scout. That is why this plot can become so much darker than a simple escape story. Scout represents consequence. She represents the human cost of Jason's life, the cost that cannot be cleaned up with strategy or force. Through her, Jason is forced to see that danger does not always arrive through guns, ambushes, or secret enemies. Sometimes it arrives through the people who love him, the people connected to him, the people whose lives are damaged simply because his world is too dangerous to touch without being burned by it. That realization would hit Jason harder than any direct threat because it destroys the illusion that he can contain the harm. Once that truth begins to settle in, Jason's decision to go to Canada alone starts to feel less like a tactical choice and more like self-exile. He may tell himself that he is doing the right thing. He may convince himself that Britt has a better chance without being tied to whatever emotional wreckage is now forming back home. He may even believe that leaving alone is a form of protection. But underneath all of that would be something much more painful. Jason would be punishing himself. He would be acting like a man who has begun to believe he does not deserve to take anyone with him into the future because too much damage already follows his name. That emotional shift is what makes the story work. Jason is not a man who breaks down in dramatic speeches. He goes silent. He becomes colder. He buries panic inside action. So the audience would understand his unraveling not through confession but through behavior. His conversations would become more practical. His time with Britt would feel strained, not because he loves her less, but because loving her now feels dangerous in a new way. The more Scout's crisis grows, the more Jason would start pulling inward, replaying every recent choice, and wondering if he failed to see this disaster coming. He would become obsessed with the idea that he should have stopped it sooner. That obsession is important because it transforms Jason's departure into something tragic. Canada becomes more than a destination. It becomes a way for Jason to remove himself from a story he no longer trusts himself to fix. He would not believe he is escaping cleanly. He would believe he is stepping aside because his presence only makes things worse. And for a character like Jason, that belief is devastating. His whole identity has always been tied to protection, to control, to absorbing danger so other people do not have to. But what happens when he starts to believe that he is not protecting anyone anymore? What happens when he sees himself as the source of the damage rather than the shield against it? That is where Scout's role becomes heartbreaking. She does not just create a problem for Jason to solve. She forces him to question his entire role in the lives of the people around him. Her pain becomes symbolic of something larger. She becomes the face of everything Jason has failed to outrun. In a strange way, she becomes more terrifying to him than Cullum, because Cullum is just another enemy. Scout is conscience, Scout is memory. Scout is the proof that emotional fallout cannot be buried forever. Britt would likely feel this change before Jason ever says it out loud. She would sense that something inside him has shifted. The plan that once felt like an escape route would now feel heavy, fragile, and uncertain. Jason would still speak about logistics, timing, danger, and the need to move carefully, but the emotional warmth behind the plan would be gone. Britt would recognize that the distance growing between them is not only about external threats, it is about guilt. It is about Jason looking at himself differently and no longer believing he has the right to choose happiness while chaos is spreading behind him. That is what makes Britt's position in this story so sad. She may think she can still reach him, still remind him that survival is possible, still convince him that leaving together is not selfish. But Jason's guilt over Scout and the disaster unfolding around her would likely make him harder and harder to reach. He would start confusing sacrifice with responsibility. He would think that going alone is noble, when in reality it may be another form of emotional self-destruction. He would be choosing isolation because isolation feels safer than risking one more person getting hurt. The tragedy, of course, is that Jason's attempt to control the damage may only make things worse. That is the cruel beauty of a story like this. In trying to protect everyone, he could deepen Britt's fear, increase Scout's emotional instability, and create even more space for his enemies to strike. Jason has always believed that carrying the burden alone is the cleanest solution. But this storyline could prove that his oldest survival instinct is also his greatest weakness. By shutting people out, he may accidentally create the very disaster he is trying to prevent. If he actually makes it to Canada alone, the pain would not lessen. It would grow. Distance would not free him from guilt. It would trap him inside it. Away from Port Charles, stripped of constant action and familiar distractions, Jason would be left with his own thoughts. And that is when Scout's impact would become even larger. She would no longer just be part of the crisis back home. She would become the symbol of everything haunting him. Every silent moment would force him to confront the same question. Did he leave to protect the people he loves, or did he leave because he could not bear to face what his life has done to them? That question would slowly destroy his sense of certainty. Jason has survived countless physical threats, but emotional uncertainty is much harder for him to endure. He knows how to fight enemies. He knows how to act under pressure. What he does not know how to do is live with the possibility that his most important decision was the wrong one. If Scout's suffering continues while he is gone, that guilt would become unbearable. He would start seeing Canada not as refuge but as proof of cowardice. He would start wondering whether leaving alone was ever about protection at all, or whether it was simply a way to avoid witnessing the full damage up close. That is why the story has such strong dramatic potential. It turns Jason's strength against him. His instinct to endure pain privately, to isolate himself, to solve every problem through silence and sacrifice, becomes the very thing pushing him deeper into emotional ruin. Scout's disaster changes everything because it strips away Jason's usual certainty and leaves him with something far more dangerous than an armed enemy: self-blame. And once that takes hold, every decision becomes heavier. Every mile to Canada becomes lonelier. Every thought about Britt becomes sadder, because he would start to see her not as the future he almost had, but as one more person he had to leave behind for her own good. In the end, Jason going to Canada alone would not just be a plot twist, it would be a confession. A quiet confession that he no longer believes he is allowed to carry love with him. A confession that Scout's pain has forced him to see himself through a harsher lens. A confession that the real disaster is no longer just the danger circling outside him, but the emotional collapse happening within him. That is what makes this version of the story so powerful. It is not loud tragedy. It is not just suspense. It is the slow, painful unraveling of a man who has spent years surviving everything except his own conscience.